a hero for all of us here because we do every day struggle for justice and for rights. And we too, as trade unionists, are vilified for that. Certainly not to the extent, I suppose, that Gillian was, but we feel it when people vilify us as trade unionists. But it's people like Gillian who understand what that's like, but who don't give up, and who, we were just having a chat about this, who actually at the end of the day place their trust in the Australian people, in the people who are our members, in the people who we fight for every single day. You know, recently, as you might have seen, we all noticed there's been a very concerted attack from this government on trade unions. Year after year, it's intensifying every month, every week, every day. But has it actually turned around anything for them in the polls? It has not. Australian people now are wise to this. Australian people understand what the government is systematically trying to do. The government is not winning with this crusade. Yes, it is shameful that it is allowed to happen. Yes, it is unbelievable that in the name of balance, we have our media giving airtime to racists, to awful people in so-called name of balance. But because of you, because there are good people like you, because we have wonderful people like Gillian Triggs, you know what? Good will win out in the end. Gillian said to me that she's a bit worried that her speech is a little bit serious. I said, don't worry, we do serious very well. But we also like to have fun. But I know that what Gillian has to say, you will hear, you will take away with you, and you will use it as fodder for our continued fight for justice and solidarity. Gillian, I'm so pleased that we have you here tonight. Please carefully make your way.
Welcome from friends and people who've been so supportive of the Human Rights Commission and for me over the years. I do have a bit of a speech and I feel like tearing it up and throwing it away and talking to you about a lot of other things, but I'll basically stick to the agenda. It's wonderful to be with you tonight and to be with such warm and understanding and committed company. I'm, of course, a 10-pound commie migrant and a dual national. But I too acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. This is much more for me and for you than a formulaic statement. I feel very deeply about it, and I'm deeply shocked that our government has rejected the proposal from the Advisory Council that we finally have some form of recognition of Indigenous Australia. So congratulations, and that's really what I wanted to say tonight. Congratulations to Union Aid Abroad for the really exceptional internationalist program that you provide in education and training to promote some form of self-reliance within the Asian Pacific region, to promote justice, equality and human rights in an international context as well as within Australia. These are extraordinary times, and as many of you here tonight will remember, I was at the university, at the law school here at Melbourne in the 60s, and I walked behind Jim Cairns in the moratorium marches against Vietnam. I was a feminist, and we metaphorically burnt our bras. We read Simone de Beauvoir and Second Sex and Sartre, and we talked a lot of nonsense over Chianti bottles with candles stuck in the middle of them. But those were wonderful years in which it was the best of times. Everything was possible for my generation, for women, for workers, for Australia. And it's with such disappointment that I now see, in the second decade of the 21st century, the powerless position in which we're in today. I've never seen Australian politics in such a despairing situation, and I could never have believed that we've embarked on immigration and refugee policies of the dire kind that we have today. And I'll come back to this in a moment. But what I really want to do today is to congratulate you for the work that you do. I've learned more about where the funding comes from. It comes from you. It comes from your members. And you are generous enough and broad-minded with a vision to draw the funds together to work with workers, with associations, with groups particularly across the region. And I think that's leadership of the best kind, according to the values that Australia has fought so hard to maintain. So congratulations for that. Your programs in Vietnam on supply chains, the Myanmar labour law reforms, the asbestos eradication program that's been described, the work that we're doing for migrant workers. I understand we've been working for many years in Palestine with Palestinian workers' associations. And working on something that I know a little bit about, which is the coal dumping in the Manila Harbour. But I've really been astonished myself. I hadn't realised that Union Aid Abroad was doing such useful work across the region. Well, you won't be surprised to know, of course, that my perspective to all of these questions, women's economic empowerment, freedom to associate, and migration rights, these are seen by me through the lens of human rights law, the rule of law, and the international treaties that we're party to. In other words, it's not about anecdotes, it's not about sentimentality, it's not even about morality or the right thing to do. My perspective is that these are legally enforceable rights, and if they're not enforceable, they should be. And one of the areas that I've been working on through the Commission is, of course, the ILO conventions. And sometimes, we talk about these things, they roll off the tongue, but they established principles that were understood in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. For example, the ILO Conventions 111 and 56 require equality of treatment in employment and occupation with respect to race, sexual orientation. In the 60s, trade union activities, marital status, and all forms of impairment and disability. Despite these principles, we live in a region, the Asian Pacific, where states have often not signed up to the major human rights treaties, and where even if they have signed up to those treaties, their state parliaments, including those of Australia, have not passed the legislation to give effect to those human rights in their national laws. And compounding the problem, there is no regional consensus on the rule of law. And like every other region in the world, the Asian Pacific nations have not agreed to any regional human rights convention establishing a local court, such as the European Court of Human Rights, that sets the standards and the jurisprudence and the commitments to basic norms within the region. Well, you or many of you will remember, as I do, because I'm getting on a bit, Australia has been, historically, a good international citizen. And I start my dating from those extraordinary days of Doc Evatt. You'll all remember. Doc Evatt was a feisty, brilliant lawyer. And not only did he contribute to the Charter of the United Nations, this great vision to stop wars and conflict because of the connection between conflict and fundamental social justice and human rights. But he was also invited by Eleanor Roosevelt back into Washington in 1948 to help draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you might know this, and I think it's an astonishing fact, that he was President of the General Assembly, extraordinary for the time, of a country that was barely flexing its muscles as a sovereign nation. As President, he ensured that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed without a single negative vote. And that is an enormous achievement by this remarkable man, and he set the standard from then until, and I've put the date, and you may have another one, 2001, that extraordinary year of the throwing the children overboard misstatement. It was a totally inaccurate statement. It was proven to be so by a subsequent Senate inquiry, but the government of the day nonetheless won their way back into election. It was the same year as the Tampa crisis, when this wonderful humanitarian Norwegian ship's captain, against all instructions, sailed the Tampa into the waters, territorial waters here in Melbourne, and then the great views of Justice North. But a couple of months later, the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon in the United States. And I think that glorious tradition of Australia of being actively involved in human rights and social justice, that's when it came to a grinding halt. Because from then on, respective governments had conflated the fear of terrorism with the fear of asylum seekers and refugees, and with the rhetoric of protecting our borders and saving lives at sea. And if you want an historical analysis, I think we can take it back to that. But what is particularly concerning is that we are now, as a nation, exceptionalist and isolated from international human rights standards. And let me just give you one example, because I used to be a law lecturer, and I'm afraid I can give a lecture from 5 minutes past the hour to 5 minutes to the hour, and it depends on the bell ringing. And I won't do that to you tonight because you're having a great time at dinner and it's a great atmosphere. But just to contrast the view of the Papua New Guinea Supreme Court that was unanimous in saying that to detain the now 600 but then 800 men on Manus Island compulsorily, without a future, without proper legal process, and with no proper settlement opportunities. The Papua New Guinea Supreme Court said that was contrary to their constitution because it breached the right to liberty in their constitution. Within a few months of that was the Australian High Court decision that said to send women and their babies back to Nauru from Australia was constitutionally valid. Why? Because we have none of the human rights treaties as part of Australian law, or very few of them, race, sex and disability. All the rest are not there. The Refugee Convention, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is not part of Australian law. We are the only country, only democracy, I should say, in the world that does not have a Bill of Rights, and we are the only common law country in the world without a Bill of Rights. So our High Court can find all of these policies to be constitutionally valid. And how extraordinary with that relatively new country to the north of us can get to the right answer, but to create, of course, this terrible environment that we're seeing. Well, these are extraordinary circumstances, and I should say a word about the role of the Australian Human Rights Commission that so many of you have supported in many ways. We do, in fact, have a significant international aid program, and that is why I'm so pleased to see the work that you're doing. But just very briefly, we've worked with there's a group of 119 national human rights bodies in the world, and that is growing in importance, and it now has legal status before the United Nations bodies. We've worked on the death penalty moratorium within the region, and something is being achieved. We now have a moratorium in many countries, or at least those penalties for which the death penalty applies has been significantly reduced. China and Vietnam remain the main countries that employ that penalty, and a lot of work has yet to be done, but I think there's more that we can do. One thing that I did want to mention, and you may or may not be aware of it, is that the Australian Human Rights Commission has run a bilateral human rights technical program with China for about 18 years. And for the first time, we're the only country, I understand, that's had that strong bilateral relationship with China on human rights We didn't talk about freedom of speech in Tiananmen Square. I don't think we'd have been very successful at that. But we worked wonderfully with the Chinese government and with the Chinese people on violence against women, on access to fair access to employment for those with disabilities and for older Chinese, and for working with migrant labour within China. It was a very good program, but it now appears that that has come to an end, and I think we need to ask questions about how that has happened. But I'll come to the main thing that I want to speak to you about, and that is the problem of Rohingya and refugees. The Human Rights Committee, just in the last few days, has called yet again on Australia to comply with its human rights obligations, and the United Nations has called the situation in Manus a looming humanitarian crisis, which is a textbook example of ethnic cleansing in our region. The United Nations has said Australia is responsible. We cannot wash our hands of this disgraceful affair. It's in breach of the Refugee Convention, the principle of non-refoulement, and the UN continues to be fearful of sexual assault, the failure to provide adequate medical care, clean water, basic food and clothing for now 600 men in Nauru, in Manus Island. They're saying, and we know it to be true, that if they seek to go into the local community, the local people are not welcoming, and there have been more than one occasions of assault, including sexual assault. I'm not really blaming the people of Manus. It's a huge burden to place on them when the fundamental responsibility lies with Australia, and we all have to stand up for that principle. The mass movement of peoples is, of course, a global phenomenon. 65 million people on the move. It's a huge global issue. But one that is now starting to have a particular impact in our region is the refusal by the government of Myanmar over many decades to recognise citizenship of the Rohingya people. Statelessness is exceptionally high in the Asian region, and at the moment UNICEF estimates 320,000 children have fled to Bangladesh, with about 800,000 refugees trapped in statelessness. And while this is going on, the Australian government, according to The Guardian, I believe every word of The Guardian, is offering $25,000 to Rohingya refugees, and they are refugees, on Manus to return to Myanmar. I think the plight is a truly desperate one, and we have to stand up as a nation for the values that our forebears fought for humanitarian treatment. I believe, of course, that Australia is a national sovereign entity. We must protect our borders, and of course we want to protect deaths at sea. But I believe we can achieve those objectives while at the same time protecting the rights of children and the rights of those that seek our assistance. Finally, can I say, one of the things that I have learned in this job is the importance of working with the business community. And there are many examples, and I think you are doing this as well. Sometimes you can get a lot further working with business, working on ethics as a business priority, than you can with governments that work from ideological perspectives. And so I think these are the areas, particularly in the Asian region, on trafficked workers, migrant workers. If we work positively with the business community, who are growing and increasingly caring about these issues, I think we can achieve more than we would perhaps by working directly with government. Well, I'd like to conclude, if I may, and I'm sure you really want to get back to your conversations, but it's a huge pleasure to be with you, but I would really love the union movement to stand up to speak for a Bill of Rights for Australia. I think it is unconscionable that we have no legal mechanisms no reason by which for the courts to apply the same standards that our neighbour Papua New Guinea is capable of applying. And I know that the goodwill in this room, the work that you do, I know you have the strength and the authority to stand up for these principles. I completely agree with Ged. It's been astonishing to me that there's been an implication in the right-wing media that if you're connected with a union, you are somehow un-Australian. Now, we all know that lawyers who work for asylum seekers are un-Australian, but we're coping with that. But you see that insidious denigration creeping across our entire community. And I know, and I'm sure you know, we will get through this period in Australian political history. We will get through it, and indeed I can see some light emerging at the end of the tunnel out there. We will get there, but we have to stand up for the truth, not balance, as Ged says, not balance, but the truth, and to stand up for what we know to be right. So thank you for listening to me tonight so politely, and I look forward to working with you in the future.